Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julian Johnson, and here to present to you and talk to you about something that's very kind of foundational to the Rosicrucian view of the world and existence. I've been a member of the Rosicrucian for many, many years, and have a particular attraction to science and kind of the melding of where, I'd say, science meets mysticism, so to speak. And so one of these very important topics, and I have to say that when I first became a member of the Rosicrucian Order, began studying Rosicrucian teachings, was introduced to this concept very early on, is what the Rosicrucian teachings refer to as spirit energy, and saying that all of kind of physical reality is a result of this spirit energy and its differing rates of vibration. And spirit here is not used as in spiritual or spirits, flying around or otherwise, but the notion of a cosmic energy that underlies all phenomena that we experience, and the difference between one thing and another, one substance and another, lead and gold or wood and something else, is the rate of vibration of this energy. So a fairly unusual view of the world and so on. But what is so kind of fascinating is now, decades after being introduced to that concept, that physical material science, Western science, has actually come to a very similar point of view, if even not identical point of view. And that's really what I wanted to explore, for one. And related to that, which kind of brings it to us as individual human beings, is the realization that the reality that we perceive is a reality conditioned by our minds. That it is a finite appreciation of all that is, and it is very much the result of our senses, our physical senses, and they're providing information or data, so to speak, which then is processed by the mind or brain, which then gives us our reality. And so I want to kind of explore the foundation of this, which is looking at this idea of spirit energy and its various vibration or vibratory rates, and their relationship to the physical world, as now modern science has come to recognize. But even more so is for us to recognize how limited our perception and appreciation of the entirety of reality, or even the physical aspects of reality. And that limitation is due to our sensory apparatus, and we'll kind of explore that as well. My hope is that you'll take away from this is a realization that what we simply perceive through our objective senses is not all there is by any means. And that as we even will compare ourselves to some other animals that are clearly experiencing a different world, that through perceptions that exceed our own. So I think if we come away with realizing that our human perception of reality is extremely finite, and therefore perhaps not being so absolute, perhaps in our interpretations of the world. I think as we come to recognize the limitations of our sensory information, we can maybe come to appreciate that perhaps we don't know all there is to know, or all that is about us. So that's where I want to begin. So we're going to kind of lead us through a little slide deck here, and let me see if I get this all done right. And we're going to switch to that there, and let's hope the magic of it all works, and looks like it has. If I can now get that out of the way. Good. So anyway, here's again the basic, all is vibration, where science meets Rosicrucian wisdom. So modern science confirms a fundamental Rosicrucian teaching, and that everything in the universe is a vibration of an all-pervasive energy. We're going to explore that now. And let's go kind of into it from the, let's say, the scientist's point of view. If I get my stuff here working here, okay, we're going to do that. Great. So, and this is kind of comparing what Rosicrucians call spirit energy and what modern physicists call the quantum field. So, from a Rosicrucian perspective, as it's noted here, there's for literally going back, I guess, thousands of years in this primordial wisdom tradition, said that there's an all-pervasive spirit energy throughout the universe, and that it is what gives rise to the physical world. And as it's noted here, energy manifests at different frequencies to create our physical world. So what does modern science come to? For those of you here that have studied or read up on quantum physics, which is really the front end of physics at this stage, physicists really describe a very similar concept called the quantum field, and they'll kind of also fields, there are multiple fields kind of in this quantum field. But both perspectives recognize vibration as the fundamental nature of existence. And in another video that you'll find up on the Rosicrucian website or on YouTube, Rosicrucian channel, is one that kind of looks at some of the science and really kind of citing and scientists in their own words about the notion, this vibratory nature of reality. So the basic notions of quantum physics and quantum mechanics and quantum fields is that the fields fill space. So the quantum field, and I say there are variations on the field, there's electromagnetic field, there are a variety of these kind of fields that kind of are interspersed from this point of view, but the quantum field permeates everything, leaving no true emptiness. So what people used to think was empty space, that is now how physicists look at it nowadays. And what we perceive as the particles, so protons, neutrons, electrons, positrons, bosons, mesons, all of the people call the zoo, the zoo of particles, the particle zoo, as some people say in the scientific community, and there's like tons of these different particles. They would say these are simply localized excitations of these particular fields. And basically these particles come into and out of existence based on vibrations of the quantum field. So whereas it up until really this quantum field theory, which is this is kind of what we're drawing from here. So QFT, as it's called, for those of you who might want to look into it more. Basically, before we had this, what they say, the standard model, there were all these particles. And you have accelerators, particle accelerators kind of banging these very elementary particles into one another at very high speeds, very high energies, and discovering further particles, which is where the particle zoo kind of metaphor comes from. But it was believed that particles were the things that basically were the building blocks of the universe. There is kind of a little bit of a separation there in that theory when you now then get into the question, are they particles or are they waves? And some of you might be familiar with the double slit experiment, which basically shows light to be manifest both as particles and as waves, depending on the conditions that the measurement is done under. Right, so you've got, but nevertheless, the particle theory has been the dominant theory. This quantum field theory is saying that there's really this ground, this background energy that everything is part of. It permeates everything. There's no empty space. And there's these vibration and excitation and particles coming into and out of existence in this quantum field, so that the fundamental nature of the universe is not particles, but this quantum energy or quantum field. So matter, basically, which we look at as static substances, are really physical objects. They're energetic vibrations. And so let's look at that last point a little bit. You can look at, I mean, one kind of very elementary way is to look and say, well, an atom is about 99% space, right? The nucleus kind of takes up a little bit of it, and then you've got the electrons, and again, they're not quite particles, viewed as particles anymore, but kind of more like waves or fields. But they take up another tiny part. And so overall, the atom is, greater than 98% space. So even though we perceive it and say that is solid and opaque and somewhat impermeable, but the reality is it's largely space. So, well, that's kind of interesting. Being that it is actually space, it really is an energy field, and we ourselves are interacting with an energy field. So matter, which we may look at as static, actually is vibrating at enormously high rates of vibration. I mean, the kind of hundreds of millions of vibrations per second. And I think we're familiar, likely all have heard of the idea of the atomic clocks being used to measure time very, very accurately. And that's based on the vibrations of typically a cesium atom, and that vibrates at extremely high frequencies. So while we may think things are static because they look to be solid, but actually they are vibrating energy, that the challenge is because of our senses, our physical senses, and that's the case of both sight and touch, right, are not fine enough in their resolution to be able to perceive that basically this solid matter really is space, and in order to be able to perceive the vibrations at those very, very high rates. Yes, if it's vibrating at a much lower rate, we'd be able to perceive it through touch, but at the extremely high rates that which matter vibrates, it's imperceptible to our senses. So again, this is a little bit where our senses are kind of deceiving us somewhat. So the Rosicrucian studies used to introduce something called the cosmic keyboard, and really what it is what a bit of what is laid out here in this slide, where you're going from infrasounds, which might be 5 cycles per second, which, for instance, elephants and some other creatures are able to respond to and actually communicate through infrasounds, very low frequency sounds. And they're called infrasounds is because they're below the sound, below the frequency of sound that the human ear is able to detect. So audible sound, which really means audible to humans, there are lots of other creatures that would have different numbers here, but basically it's 20 cycles per second up to 20,000 cycles per second. Right, so that's what we call sound. It doesn't mean they're not other sounds, quote unquote, or that they're not vibrations of that are passed through the atmosphere by vibrating air, and that other creatures aren't able to perceive. So infrasound are those kind of below the 20 hertz. And actually, as we generally get past the teen years, our ears do not respond as well to the higher ranges of 20 up to 20,000 hertz. Generally, that gets cut off as we kind of are more exposed to sounds and age. So next you have between that kind of infrasound and audible sound, you have radio waves, which includes, we could say, microwave radiation. So that microwave oven is kind of between the 20,000 and then when you get to the low end of the electromagnetic frequencies. So radio waves that transmit all types of things through the air, and obviously before the invention of cable and streaming, that's how we watch TV and other things like that. Then you have visible light, and I think most of us have likely seen the depiction of visible light being this tiny, 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 like tiny narrow piece of the electromagnetic spectrum, right? That's visible light, that light humans can see. And then we get out to things like X-rays and gamma rays and cosmic rays, and we go from one end again where it's under 20 cycles per second to things like cosmic rays, which are sextillions of vibrations per second. And I might note here that those cosmic rays, or what are called cosmic rays, are basically the limit based on our ability to create instruments to perceive these things. It doesn't mean that there are not higher vibratory rates beyond the what are called cosmic rays. It just means that we do not yet have instruments that allow us to be sensitive enough to recognize things beyond the rate of vibration of cosmic rays. So you have this spectrum of vibration. We humans pick up only a few places on it. Touch kind of is in there, kind of a bit before the radio waves. We've got sound, which we can hear. We've got visible light. Our smell is basically responding to the the molecules and their frequencies, and smell, touch, taste, and taste is also responding to those molecular frequencies as well. But altogether, it turns out to be a tiny part, and that's kind of summarized when you kind of look at here again. Vision only detects visible light. Taste kind of identifies these chemical compounds in food. Smell detects airborne chemicals, right? So taste is kind of getting them directly, and smell is doing it through the airborne. Touch is essential, responding to pressure and temperature, in addition to, obviously, when encountering material things, you're getting a resistance at the molecular level between our fingers, if we're trying to touch something with our fingers, and that substance itself. Because in actuality, we never touch, the molecules never touch. Right? It would take extreme pressures to overcome the forces, molecular forces that of repulsion. So we are simply responding to the fields that these molecules and are kind of radiating, and those molecules of our fingers and bodies when we're sensing what to us feels like we're touching them. But on a molecular level, they don't actually touch, right? Your finger doesn't touch. It's really kind of the molecules and the forces that of repulsion that we're sensing as pressure, which then kind of gives us some information. So this is another little kind of way of charting it out here. Infrasound, sound, ultrasonic, that's kind of from that 20 hertz then to greater than 20,000 hertz. You've got the kind of vibrations will be experienced through touch, which is basically 1 to 1,000 hertz. You've got these higher frequencies associated with matter. Then you've got X-rays and gamma rays, which kind of has now been jumbled into AXE or gamma rays. Kind of got beaten up there by ChatGPT's diagramming function. So we'll correct that. But and then you have infrared, visible light also, X-rays, gamma rays, etc. So this is these things. But I want you to kind of think about this: is that basically, 99.999% of the vibratory energies that we exist in the midst of are not perceptible to us visibly, and very limited, we know, through touch and taste. So, so the world that we've created through our senses, or was created for us, is not actually at all the entirety of the world that we're in, right? You can see, or I think can recognize from this, that it's a very tiny percentage of the possible sensory information or possible information about the world we exist in that actually becomes recognized through our senses. So, I mean, I'm going to say, let us kind of adopt a sense of humility when we think about what we know of the world we exist in, right? We know so little in reality of it. And our senses kind of create this world for us, and they're quite limited. So, but let's look at how this all happens, by the way. It's quite fascinating. So our sense organs, and in some ways you could look at this like it's if they were like a TV antenna or a radio antenna, right? So our sense organs pick up on these specific frequencies, right? And they're stimulated just like a radio antenna would pick up those type of things. And then those frequencies, that energy that basically reaches the antenna, a very sensitive antenna, and antennas are tuned to different wavelengths of energy, different frequencies, right? Depending on the size of the antenna, et cetera, right? And the construction of it. So those basically signals, that energy that strikes the antenna, in this case, our senses, then is converted into electrical signals, because our bodies run on electricity, right? So it's converted into electrical signals. And that's done by our nervous system. And those electrical signals ultimately then are directed up to the brain. And then the brain constructs this reality for us. So, here's one I like the example of vision, right? We see something outside of ourselves. In this case, we're imagining it's a candle that first, let's say, is to the left of the face of the image. So the person is perceiving that there's an image that's coming in on the retina, coming through the lens of the eye onto the retina. Right, it's a tiny image, very small, and it's upside down. Right, the image gets twisted upside down when it goes through the lens. Excuse me. And then that image and the energy is striking the cones and rods on the back of our retina, right? And that then stimulates electrical signals, which then go through the optic nerve up to a part of our brain. And somehow or another, a picture is created in our mind, right, of what quote unquote reality is. But this reality has been created basically by, kind of a process, an electronic process, and in this case, kind of a living processor. You could look at the analogy again of a cable box, right? So a cable box has got a signal coming in from Time Warner or whoever it's coming in from, right? Spectrum, whatever it is. You've got Fios maybe. Okay, so that's coming in that signal, right? So that's the picking up from the other source and kind of sending along electrical impulses. That signal goes into the cable box, and out of it, it kind of distinguishes, well, as we're going to pay attention to this or that various quote unquote channels. And then out of that electrical signal, a image is created, which then appears on your TV. And that really is what happens when we see something, right? There's an object outside of ourselves. We perceive it. The light strikes, comes in through our eyes, strikes the retina. The cones and rods in the back of the retina are stimulated by the photons, the electrical the energy of the photons reaching our rods and cones. They in turn generate an electrical signal. The electrical signal then is passed on the optic nerve, which is attached to the back of the eye. Then optic nerve comes up into the brain, into the occipital lobe, and there, somehow miraculously, a picture is formed of that candle. And as you might have all have heard, back in ancient times, people wanted to, when cutting people's heads open, to see where was the screen? Where's this picture formed? Where's the screen? But basically, the picture is simply formed in consciousness, right? Brain, and obviously the connection between the higher faculties of self interacting with the material brain generate an image in our consciousness and realization, because there is no TV screen, there's no movie screen in our heads. So that's kind of how reality is formed. So there's this translation of signals that ultimately get processed and create a reality. And keeping in mind, even with the optical reality that we are referring to here, is our two eyes basically give two different pictures of that candle. And in both cases, those are inverted upside down. They're upside down on the retina. But somehow or another, those signals are melded, and then an image appears in our consciousness. Right? They're brought together, and then our brains, our minds, that consciousness kind of creates an upside-up image that's not tiny anymore, and is basically giving us a three-dimensional perspective of that object. So, and if you kind of look at it, there are 8 billion individuals on this planet or so, and actually likely, give or take a few more, right? But let's say there are 8 billion individual realities, right? Each one of us has a unique perception of reality. There are no two people who experience the exact same reality, right? We have differences in our senses, right? Some of us are nearsighted, some are farsighted, some have better color vision than others, et cetera, et cetera. We have differences in our brain structures, and our brains basically the ones that do the processing, right? And that processing can be very conditioned by our past experiences, right? So things that stand out for us, things that are come into higher and clearer resolution for us, both emotionally as well as physically, right? Are all conditioned by our past experiences. So if we keep in mind that no two people have the same experience of reality, it may help us come to appreciate how we can have sometimes such different points of view about reality. Right? There's clearly overlap enough for us to function as a society, but no two of us has the exact same experience. I, for one, have lots of experience with taste that is clearly different than a lot of other people in my family and others that I've met, because I cannot figure out how someone possibly could like the taste of a Brussels sprout. All right, not to mention lima beans and a few other uh, gross, distasteful foods. But people also love it. They have a very different taste experience of it, and that has to do with really genetics in large part when it comes to things like Brussels sprouts and the brain structure and how uh, uh, our taste buds react to certain chemicals that are present, for instance, in Brussels sprouts. So no two of us has the same reality, and I think surely food gives us a good example of how we can have such different taste experiences of what we consider to be desirable and pleasurable versus disgusting or unsatisfactory. So, keeping in mind, 8 billion of us all kind of different. And what's kind of also fascinating is something called synesthesia, and I'm guessing that many of us are familiar with that or heard of it, right? And that's kind of what I like to say, where the cable wires, the wires got crossed in the cable box. Right. So there's about 10 to 15% of the population is estimated, but there's some very prominent examples of these things of how the vibrations of this quantum field, spirit energy, right, not only stimulate the sensory organ that we're most familiar with it stimulating, but also stimulates another sensory organ as well. And these folks are called synesthetes. And a very common one is people seeing certain colors associated with certain sounds or music. And it's consistent. So it's not like, oh, gee, this one person. No, people who have this will see similar colors related to these sounds. There's also people, which is quite interesting, have an association of color with certain letters and numbers. So here's what we've got. And one example, you can look at the tactile one, right? So it triggers a visual or taste experience. It's very interesting. You read reports of people saying certain words have a taste to them. They don't like the way it tastes. Now, of course, we would just say, well, we like the way it sounds, but they hear it, but they also have a taste sensation. Makes a much more interesting world in some ways, right? Of experiencing the world so much more broadly. We can look at low frequency sounds, right? Low frequency sounds tend to stimulate both our kind of audio perception, hearing, but also will stimulate our tactile or sense of touch, right? So very deep bass, right? We will get a kind of a sensory response, both of touch as well as auditory. So synesthesia and synesthetes. It's a really interesting topic to go and research and kind of get to understand the variations in human perception. Again, the world is not exactly how we think it is. It's somewhat constructed based on basically our sensory apparatus and the processing that goes on in response to kind of the sensory apparatus. So I want to share with you also something I kind of find fascinating, and I'm going to guess that all of us have seen a little bit of this, but I wanted just to bring it to the attention of everyone today, is that scientists, generally people kind of in the medical profession, along with medical researchers, have shown that by stimulating certain areas of the brain during surgery, one is able to have the subject report various things. So if they're stimulating the occipital cortex, which is again the optic nerve goes to the occipital cortex, right? That people can spontaneously, even though their eyes are closed, see what they call phosphene, which is really just kind of lights. Also shapes and motion and colors. So in very, very, very long time ago, there was a TV commercial. It's for really older people here on this call, but and the tagline, and it was for an audio tape, recording tape, and the tagline was, "Is it live or is it Memorex?" And that's so interesting when you think about being able to stimulate a part of the brain, and a person has the exact same experience as if their eyes were open, as an example. Same thing with people hearing musical tones, and by stimulate another part of the brain. This little map here, the temporal cortex in this case, kind of lays out the areas of the brain if stimulated correctly. Uh, People will hear music, voices, and tones. So, uh, you know, you get down to really what is the reality. Then you can see tactile, olfactory, gustatory, which relates to taste, and then you get the kind of the things about movement, which can parallel what we normally would pick up about movement and position from our inner ear, right? But that can be stimulated without moving the person's head, where they will have that experience. There's also some reference here to emotional and memory responses, and something that I was not actually familiar with, but for these French speakers here, they likely will recognize this. So we all, kind of familiar with déjà vu, with I'm going to say this jamais vu, but pardon the butchering of the French there, which is kind of where a person, something they're actually familiar with will seem new to them. So it's kind of like the opposite of déjà vu, where you think, well, gee, I think I've experienced this before. Whereas in demise vu, it's like, oh, gee, this is new, but actually, it's actually something they've experienced many times before, but getting to a different kind of experience by stimulating a certain part of the brain. And as some of you may know, there's a professor who was at a university in Canada, but he passed away about 10 years ago, who had created what Newsweek magazine called the God Helmet, where through using electromagnetic kind of pulses configured in a helmet, he could help induce in people having the experience of various spiritual kind of states, and depending on their background, seeing Jesus, seeing the Buddha, whatever the case was. And so, if you're interested in that, actually, you can Wikipedia this guy's name is Michael Persinger, and it's like Singer the Sewing Machine, but Persing, a P-E-R in front of it. And he was at Laurentian University, and it's easy to find stuff on him. He's actually a very serious researcher, kind of had a kind of a neuroscience, obviously background, but also was quite interested in kind of geophysical anomalies, which very often people refer to as sacred sites. And his research kind of, because he had a background somewhat in geophysics as well, he was curious about whether there were actually some physical anomalies to these sites which people identified as kind of having special properties. And his research showed that in many cases, there were crystalline formations in those areas, and some of you familiar with sort of basic kind of physics. Let's say if you put a crystal under pressure, like a quartz crystal under pressure, it will generate a electric current, and electric current produces a magnetic field automatically. That's where electromagnets come from in motors, right? Because a magnet will induce a current in a wire, and a current will induce create a magnetic field. And what has led him to actually create what they eventually called the God Helmet was this trying to move into the lab to replicate these unusual kind of geophysical conditions that affected the Earth's magnetic field at that local site, and to see if bringing that into the lab, he could help induce in individuals certain types of experiences analogous to when they were, out at Sedona or something. And actually, you'll find through his research, he was quite successful in being able to help engender these experiences in people in the lab. And so, again, his name is Michael Persinger. He was at Laurentian University in Canada, and I'd say maybe past the transition about 10 years ago. But, did a lot of research on rats. He's a kind of very traditional scientist type, and kind of worth further investigating. So this is where, by stimulating the brain, you can produce certain realities, right? So you can actually have a tree fall in the forest and hear it, but it's only in your brain. So I wanted to also look at again, coming back to the theme of, our limited awareness of the totality that we exist in, right? And it's so finite in comparison to this totality, but looking at other animals, living creatures on this earth, and some of their kind of sensory capabilities. And just a few of these here, but you can go to ChatGPT or research these and find many, many, many more. So you have echolocation, which bats and dolphins use, right, to navigate. You actually, though, do have some humans who generally are blind. I don't know if it's only since birth, but people who have lost sight, the visual sense, and who have developed the capability of being able to navigate in certain spaces, at least in their homes and other places, through echolocation. They make clicking sounds, and they're able to process those clicking sounds that give them a sense of kind of the physical objects in the space, somewhat akin to what vision would normally do. So we know bats and dolphins use this. Infrared vision, right? So snakes detect heat signatures invisible to human eyes. So now I guess it's why snakes are so dangerous at night, because they can see you, you can't see them, right? Fascinating, which I hadn't known about until I began to research this further. Sharks sense electrical fields generated by other creatures. Now, here's what's really interesting, right? Is that the muscular activity of fish swimming is obviously, there's electricity behind that, right? We know our nerves and muscles respond to electrical signals, right? And a variety of devices that are used for rehabilitation, right, to stimulate the muscles and so on, right? Electrical impulses, right? But sharks and some other fish are able to actually pick up the electrical signals that are generated by the muscular activity of fish swimming nearby. So they can kind of feel their lunch coming. Right. So, and think how difficult it is if you're the fish, right? Because every time you kind of move your tail or move so that's actually putting out a field that can be perceived by sharks and some other fish. And then we all kind of know about the magneto reception, right? There's this capability of birds to navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, and a number of other creatures. Now, what's quite interesting about this also is that some laboratory experiments have indicated that actually humans have a latent capacity for this. And how they've done that and demonstrated this is to put a person in a kind of a chair, strapped into a particular kind of device in a kind of enclosed space that's got kind of isolated from what they call outside radio interference, like a Faraday cage, as they call it, right, which kind of blocks out other electrical signals from outside of the room. And what they do is they put electrodes on the person's head to measure brain activity. And so they don't turn the person, but what they do instead is they alter a magnetic field they have around the person, right? Just as if the person was changing directions. They alter the field because they're in a kind of surrounded by a device that generates a magnetic field. And what they find is actually there is a response in the brain, but there's no conscious awareness of that response. So before Waze, before GPS, because you think about it, how do folks find their way back to someplace in the forest or wherever else, right? And these other things where you don't have. I get lost in Manhattan when the streets are nicely demarcated, right? I can be easily confused. But where am I? But we have this, and humans still have a bit of this latent capacity, which you'll likely find stronger in people who live in environments where it's called upon as a necessity. So this is just kind of a little review of a few of these things together, looking at different species. So we have, humans, our dominant reality experience is visual. And they estimate about 70% of kind of our brain attention is dominated by the visual sense. Limited sound is next, right? So you got visible light, small bit of that, and sound. Dogs, which is quite interesting. And if you look at a bloodhound has a scent capability of identifying scents at approximately 100,000 times out of a human. And so they're living in an environment that we have no clue about what's around us, right? There's all these scents. What's kind of fascinating, right, is there's a type of moth, or maybe many types of moth, but you can look this up. There's at least a moth that can sense one molecule of a pheromone produced by another moth at over a mile distance. One molecule, a moth, right? So, we like to think we know what's going on, right? That we're our faculties are so limited, when you kind of look at these other capabilities. Mantis shrimp, right? So humans generally are what they call trichromats. Trichromat means we basically have three colors we focus on, perceive through: red, green, and blue. And that's why your TV is kind of RGB, and they use those three colors to make up, all the other colors you perceive. There are a small percentage of humans, about 10 to 15%, who what they call quadchromats, and those individuals have a fourth color receptor. And what's interesting about them is they will perceive the mismatch of colors in a way quite differently than a person who's a regular person who's a trichromat. Whereas you likely would find that person who's got that four different color receptors, wondering why that person would wear that with that. Whereas to us, it may just look green. To them, it looks, distinctly different than just the kind of lumped in shade of green that we might perceive. Mantis shrimp happen to have 16 color receptors. So it's called hyperspectral color world, right? So what's interesting about hyperspectral color, a recognition of it, there's a ton more information. So the human visual kind of spectrum is about 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers, right? And those nanos are like millions, right? So it's very, very, kind of small in terms of the wavelength, right? For us, relatively speaking, right? To things that we normally think about, a millionth of a meter, 400 to 700 millionth of a meter. People who are hyperspectral, or insects or creatures who are hyperspectral, may go down to 200 and even below, and go up beyond the 700. So like bees see ultraviolet light. So they're going beyond the 700, right? But you have other creatures, such as these mantis shrimp, that also see below. But that allows them to perceive the moisture in something, the well-being of something, so many other characteristics that can be perceived by being able to perceive this information through one's senses and then be processed. What has happened now in modern, particularly in agriculture, is they use a type of hyperspectral imaging, basically trying to, imitate some of the capabilities of other animals. And they use that to look at crops, and they can see which crops are healthy, which ones are, have some sort of infestation, which ones are dry, because even though to our naked eye, our limited capacity, our blindness, so to speak, our color blindness, I guess you could say, we can't perceive that. But certain other creatures can, and now scientists have developed instruments to do what they call hyperspectral imaging, to be able to use that. So even from, quite airborne, they can kind of identify many characteristics of kind of living organisms and crops on the ground. And then you have elephants who have what they call infrasound, right? So elephants, that's at below the 20 hertz. It's below the base, right? But those sounds, and I think we all know that if you live in an urban environment, right, you can hear that car with that heavy bass coming for blocks, right? Because that bass travels. Well, that's something that basically elephants and other creatures that can pick up infrasounds are able to take advantage of. So elephants can communicate over very long distances, and apparently whales are as well able to produce these kind of infrasounds that travel very long distances and are able to communicate that way. So yeah. So and what I wanted to picture here, this is a little image generator pro version of, hey, if we as humans had all these additional sensory capabilities, what it would be like for us, right? If we had the magnetic sense, electroreception, perceiving all these electrical fields from other human beings, etc., we could appreciate other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, EM field vision. So you could see you could be hyperspectral in terms of your imaging. You could hear down to lower vibrations. Right. So there's a little bit of research looking at to what extent that any animals can respond to radio frequencies such as radio transmissions and cell phone kind of radiation, as an example, that's in the rooms that we're sitting in. Right. We're surrounded by all these, kind of electromagnetic fields. We're not able to perceive them, but you can imagine that humans having that kind of capability to perceive a much wider range of what we would be like if we had these. For us, I guess, would be extreme faculties, extreme capabilities that we see displayed in many animals. So, and one thing would be, and this is kind of, I think we've all seen things like this, would be infrared, right? That's 5 people, some with their backs to us, others facing frontally, at least the one on the left, but their back to us. This is kind of looking at a human being or human beings with infrared vision. And if you look at the middle figure, where the chest is very red with the dark area in there, and that's likely because they maybe just finished doing some exercise. And you can see in the thigh muscles as well, those regions there, a lot of blood flow there. So you would be able to perceive if there's some sort of abnormality with the person. Thermal imaging would be a way of perhaps being able to differentiate those things, as well as obviously being able to see people in the dark quite well. Right? Now you might think it's a horror film, but eventually you get used to it and find it really very useful if you were trying to find your friend or your dog. So we know scientists have also tried to, quite successfully, humankind has extended our senses, right? So you have radio telescopes, which allow us to capture all these radio waves that, again, we're just insensitive to. Infrared cameras, which give us these heat signatures. Electron microscopes that take us down to the atomic level and allow us to see that atoms are really more space than solid, right? Which our eyes kind of fool us into thinking, no, they're really solid. And things like particle detectors, which allow us to perceive subatomic particles. Because really, right now, at any one moment, there's several 100 million neutrinos passing through basically every kind of cubic centimeter of your body. So, but we don't feel them, we don't see them, but here they are, we're in the midst of them. So I want you to kind of, get ready to wrapping up a little bit, look at the Rosicrucian perspective on extrasensory perception. So we talked about the senses that animals have that we're kind of familiar with. They're just much better than versions than our own. But there's also the notion that there are faculties that are beyond the 5 ones and their permutations. And, there's sometimes other senses like or kind of things that characterize the senses also that are everyday things, your sense of balance and position your body and a few other things. But then looking at what very often are called extrasensory perception, it's really just expanded perceptions. And, the Rosicrucian teachings, basically from the very beginning, point out that humans possess dormant abilities to perceive beyond the 5 senses. And these faculties allow basically the perception of these cosmic vibratory energies, and very often not yet widely recognized by Western science, right? I mean, when we look at telepathy as an example, obviously there's some transmission of something or communication that allows people to be able to recognize and perceive the thoughts or some image generated by the thoughts of others, right? And from a Rosicrucian point of view, what do we say? Look, through certain specific practices and exercises, you can awaken and develop these capabilities. One, I think that's likely among the more popular, because we're very visual people, human beings, right, is the idea of perceiving auras. And from a Rosicrucian point of view, we say that the perception of an aura really is perceiving the energy field surrounding a person that emanates from their physical self, which is, kind of integrated with other kind of psychic and other aspects of themselves. And that we are able to sense this, and our realization of that sense is what forms the picture. Right. So there's vibrations, energy, electromagnetic energy, whatever frequency it may be. We're able to pick that up, and how we interpret it, we don't likely if you're Ray Charles or Ray Charles, the blind singer, or Stevie Wonder, you likely don't see it in colors. You likely see it in some other way, right? But we interpret those radiations or emanations from another person that I say typically science doesn't yet recognize that we are emanating these energies, but more commonly, we interpret them with our dominant sense, which is visual. So we see the colors around people, etc. And those things do correspond to the emotional states and sometimes physiological conditions and so on, right? Telepathy is another one. Obviously, most Rosicrucian students have spent a little time, at least demonstrating. Many human beings just have had the experience of it, right? It's just like, oh, I knew you were calling, or I just thought of you, etc., whatever the case may be. And that really is saying that we can direct our mental energy. It is an energy, can be directed. It gets transmitted through the vibrational field. Now, granted, the question here may be, is it, I don't know, it's the difference between, I think it was H. Spencer Lewis or Ralph Lewis kind of pointed out, the difference between the speed of light and the speed of thought. Speed of light is 186,000 miles per second, right? Speed of thought is instantaneous. So, but, you know, we know others can receive and perceive this transmission, but it simply may be kind of an entangled state, right? That when you're connected with another individual who you try to communicate with, it's not necessarily a thought going through some air going here or there. It's an entangled state, and it just kind of manifests with the kind of co-entangled entity, in this case, a person, right? So we receive these things, we have thought impressions, and then we kind of interpret those things. Oh, I sensed this, and I felt, you know, it meant danger, et cetera, whatever the case may be. Now, what's also interesting here is remote viewing. This is extrasensory perception again, and this is based on scientific tests done on remote viewing. And those of you, I think, was it called the Stargate project, right? Which was this project sponsored by the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, right? Looking at how could remote viewing be used for, in their case, you know, espionage purposes, right? So, okay, so they did a lot of tests, very controlled tests, scientific. What they found generally is that it wasn't something that could be used with the reliability that would satisfy them for their operational use, which I suspect is a good thing. But here's the data looking at, so chance is basically, I guess, 1 in 5 that people would get something correct on these tests. And you can look at the difference between where there was emotional content, a much higher success rate, almost 50% success rate, as well as when you have people who are trained in remote viewing doing much better. You can look at, if you want to look more research on this, Google or however you do your research nowadays, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory called the PEAR Lab, P-E-A-R. You say PEAR Lab, Princeton, remote viewing, and you'll pull up all these studies that they did on remote viewing and well establish the existence, the capability of doing remote viewing. Obviously, the challenge is no one has kind of perfected what are the ideal or optimum conditions, as well as being able perhaps to achieve those conditions at will. But so another one of these things that beyond our normal sensory apparatus, so we're not really as incapacitated as it might appear when we compare ourselves to some animals and their enormous kind of assets in terms of the traditional 5 senses akin to our own. But there are these other senses that we can also draw upon, which you know, we're just kind of looking at here. And you know, these are some other examples. Psychokinesis, mind-matter interaction. Actually, the PEAR Lab has did a tremendous amount of research. They've been in business for about 25 years. Very well controlled. It's on Princeton University's campus. It was. There were scientists, very strict controls on their research in order to do it at an institution like Princeton as well. And you have things like absent healing, and I said there's been great validation on these things. So, you know, when we kind of now come down to it and say, well, we know through Rosicrucian practices, we can develop some of these extrasensory perception, right? To extend the range of our senses. Meditation is a good practice that can accompany this, right? Because these are subtle, quiet things generally, the still small voice, right? As we cultivate kind of very positive emotions, it puts us more into communion with others, and then basically practicing these exercises. And what is also noted here is group work. There is a power to the collective vibrations when they're aligned of human, and I mean, we're all broadcasting, right? And so when we kind of are all broadcasting together in a group on a kind of common theme, everyone is enriched by it. So just a thought there. So kind of to bring us to the close of this is we also have this capability through meditation attunement to tap into the higher levels of consciousness as well. So again, our physical senses may not be the world's greatest, right? We can't see as well as an eagle. We don't actually see as well as a mantis shrimp in some ways. Don't smell as well as a dog. But we do have this capability of using other tools that we have to perceive certain other things, but at a much higher level of vibration than the physical senses make available to us. Meditation is one of those pathways. Attuning, which is really our thoughts and attitudes. So we can attune with higher vibrational frequencies, thoughts of love, communion. Attuning with your highest idea of, Nicole called it, what we Rosicrucians say, the God of your heart, the God of your realization, right? As you hold that in your thoughts, right? That will raise up your vibrational frequency also. There's a wonderful Rosicrucian exercise that we recommend. You don't need to be a member to do it, called the Celestial Sanctum, Attunement with Celestial Sanctum. It is available to anyone. It's made available through a booklet called Liber 777. And it really kind of helps one learn how to do this type of attunement, because when one does that, then one is really attuning into the source of intelligence that really underlies all of material and physical existence, our own bodies and our own consciousness. So anyway, so yeah, we got some pretty good senses. They give us a very finite impression of what the world is. We're missing out on a ton of it, but we also, though, have the gift of these higher faculties of attunement and sensing that we as humans can take advantage of, and those can empower us in our everyday physical and material lives. So anyway, that's the end of the story. I hope you found it somewhat useful, and thank you for joining in. I think it'll be available, on the web, but really ChatGPT, Google can really teach you a lot more about this than I've been able to share. So God bless and peace profound.